We here at Kink Candid are pleased to tell you a little bit more about Anchor. Anchor is our new podcast hosting software. We are in love with it. Anchor is the easiest way I have found to make a podcast. It'll give everything you need in one place, all for free, which is awesome. And you can use it from your phone or your computer. Their creation tools helped us record our first little blurb episode and edit so that it sounds great. Got music and everything else you can add to it. It's fantastic. They will handle the distribution of your podcast for you, so you can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple, Google, and much, much more that I don't even know about yet. You can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. You just have to do some ads just like this. So if you're interested in getting your podcast going with Anchor, go download the Anchor app on your iPhone or Android phone, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to another episode of King Candid. My apologies for the late upload. There have been a number of things sort of going on here lately that have contributed to us being a bit late. You do just have Shay tonight. Munchkin is a bit under the weather, so I am recording alone for the moment. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, we are talking about two things today. We are going to talk about conversion, which is a running issue that I've seen come up quite a bit of late. And we are going to talk about switches a little bit. So, on the topic of switches, I do want to state unequivocally, as I normally try to do with just about everything on the show, that I do not actually have any kind of issue with the concept of a switch. I don't fully understand it, but I definitely don't have an issue with it, even a little. So I do want to say that before I go any further, because that's something that I think this could create, to give the impression that that's something I have an issue, and I don't at all. Switches are a unique breed, and I have no issue with their desire to live their life and the lifestyle the way that works for them. So I do want to say that. Now, the issue that I wanted to talk about is the fact that Switch is, as I said, a unique breed. Switches are an entity in and of themselves, just as dominants or submissives, tops or bottoms, littles or bigs, any other classification that you can think of within the lifestyle. Switches are their own thing. And I can understand on a sort of intellectual level the desire or fun that comes from being able to experience both sides of the slash, to experience both sides of the situation and enjoy both sides of things. That is in and of itself intellectually understandable to me why someone would want to do that. However, that understanding sometimes gets a little twisted. And when I say twisted, I mean that people get this idea in their head that switch is just that, a switch that you can turn on and off, and that we all have that switch, that we all have the dominant side and a submissive side, that we all have the ability or desire to be both. And as I said, many people do. I don't know the statistics on how many people in the lifestyle obviously are switches, but I know that they exist. And the problem comes that people think that it's more normal or more natural than being one or the other. I have quite literally seen people say that if your dominant partner isn't willing and able to switch roles with you, then they are not a good dom in some way. And I think that's really, really unfair. Some people are switches, some people are dominant, some people are submissive. And I think that it is imperative that we recognize that someone can correctly, healthily be only one thing. I am not a dominant. I've never been a dominant. I cannot be a dominant. I could, if asked, service top, but that is at its core still semi-submissive, at least for me, because I'm not in charge of really of what deciding what to do. It's I want you to do this, this, and this, and that to me still resonates in the submissive part of my brain. And I am at peace with my non-dominant nature. I don't have it in me. And I know plenty of dominants who really don't have a submissive side. It's not in their nature. They don't know how to do it. They don't want to do it. And frankly, they wouldn't be very good at it because it's not in them. It's not natural for them. Does that make them a bad dom? No, it absolutely does not. It just means that they are 100% dom. I think of it in my brain at least like the continuum of sexuality. Some people are 100% or very close to it at least heterosexual. Other people are 100% or very close to it homosexual. Other people fall somewhere in between. You're bisexual, pansexual, heteroflexible, homoflexible, etc., etc. There's a continuum that exists. But no one would dare to tell a 100% or as close as one can possibly be to 100% straight individual, well, if you're not willing to at least try to sometimes have same-sex encounters, then obviously you're not doing it right. That's not fair. They can't change that. They are who they are. And it's the same concept. And I've been ragged on about this a lot, and I will freely admit that. But I'm not going to continue. I'm not going to stop saying it. I'm going to continue to speak on it. No one would tell a homosexual person, no one would tell a man who loves men or a woman who loves women, well, if you were really a good girlfriend or good boyfriend, you'd at least try to be straight for your partner if that's what they wanted, because that's what a good partner would do. That makes no sense, right? That sounds silly. Well, and telling someone who is strongly dominant or strongly submissive, well, if you were really a good partner to your dom or to your sub, you would at least try switching roles with them. And it works the same way. You wouldn't say that because it would be silly and it would make no sense. And the same is true here. It really is. And that brings me to another point, which I will get to in just a moment. But that's the point I wanted to make on switches, is that if you are a switch out there listening, please understand that you are valid in every single way. And if you are comfortable being a switch and your partner enjoys you being a switch, maybe they're a switch too, then by all means, go be switchy together. Enjoy yourself. Have fun. If, however, you find yourself with switchy tendencies and you want to switch roles because maybe you're a switch at heart, but you've been submissive for the most part, and you want to try your hand at dominance with your partner. If he is a switch, that is absolutely beautiful, and he may or may not be willing to simply say, yeah, sure, let's do that. That'll be fun. I like switching too. It'll be fun for us. If, however, you find yourself in a relationship with a dominant partner who says, no, I'm not interested in switching. I don't have a submissive side. I'm not interested in being your submissive, even for a night. Please know that that's okay. And there are conversations that may need to happen between you, but please know that it doesn't make him a bad dominant or a bad partner even. It simply is who they are. And that brings me to the second point that I want to make tonight. I have a total of three. The second point is that it has come to my attention here recently that it is quite common these days, seemingly, to tell people that submission and being a submissive is something that you do. It's a role that you play. It's a choice that you're making. It's a gift. It's something you have to re-examine and reevaluate and renegotiate on some kind of regular basis. And I want to be absolutely clear with my listeners. That is not true for every single one of us. For some of us, this is absolutely a part of who we are. We cannot change it. We did not choose it any more than we chose any other defining aspect of our personality. I am a cisgendered, bisexual woman. These things are inherent in me, and I do not have a choice in them, nor could I change them if I wanted to. These are facts. I was born this way, to quote Lady Gaga, and I cannot change it. That is just the way it is. I am also a submissive. That is also the way it is. It is a part of me as an individual. It is part of me on a deep soul level. I did not choose it. I do not have to examine it or re-examine it. It's not something I negotiate or choose on any given day. I don't wake up in the morning and decide today I'm going to be submissive. No, I simply don't. And I don't do that because I am submissive at my core. I am submissive as a human being. And I cannot change that. Now, if that is not the way that it is for someone else, that is absolutely 100, 1000% okay. If it is a role that you put on and take off, if it is something that you choose on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever schedule you have, time frame, then by all means, do that. That is absolutely valid and wonderful and beautiful. But please understand that when you decide to not only to say, this isn't how it is for me, but as I was personally recently told, this isn't how it is for anyone, that is when you are going to run into a problem. It may not be how it is for you, it is how it is for me. And I can speak for my co-hosts, every single one of them that has been on the show with me so far would tell you the same. This is who we are. We don't choose it. We don't negotiate it. We don't have to re-choose it every single day. It doesn't work that way for us. So, and that is why we are not switches. Because being a submissive is exactly who I am at my core. That's why I'm not a switch. It doesn't work that way for me. It just doesn't. And that's okay. I reiterate my previous point from our previous episode that I don't know what happened to the phrase, but it was a beautiful phrase and I love it, and I'm going to bring it back if it's the last thing I do. Your kink is not my kink, and that's okay. Your kink may not be my kink. Your lifestyle may not look anything like my lifestyle, and that is okay. It really is. But I want to give voice to the fact that this is a form and a way of doing things that does, in fact, exist. This brings me to a final point that I want to make. And this one may be a bit long, but it needs to be said because it's something that I see come up a lot. Conversion. And if this is a part-time, it's fun, but I could take it or leave it kind of thing for you, this may not be relevant. because you can take it or leave it. But if it is a huge part of who you are as a human, as a sexual being, as a partner, then this may be relevant. And it's important because it's something I think we forget sometimes. And it leads into this sort of odd gray area wherein you have people who are not in the take it or leave it group, because if they could take it or leave it, this wouldn't be an issue. And they're not fully in the this is an inherent, immutable part of my personality, because if that was the case, they would recognize the issue that they're running into. So somewhere in between lies the group that I want to speak to. These are people for whom it is more than just a sometimes play. It's more than take it or leave it, but maybe not this is who I am as an individual. And these people, these folks, sometimes find themselves in the rather unenviable position of having gotten into a relationship without discussing these desires. They have gotten into a relationship with Joe or Jane Vanilla, and now they are struggling because Joe Vanilla, or Jane Vanilla as the case may be, isn't meeting that need, isn't scratching that itch. Likely because they don't even realize that it is an itch. And they don't realize this because this wasn't a conversation that you had early on. See, for those of us who have this, see this as an immutable part of our personality, it is a very early conversation. I would never have gotten into a relationship with my other half if we weren't on the same wavelength as far as the dominant and submissive partners and roles within our dynamic. And that's not to say that we didn't have some bumps while we figured out exactly what that dynamic looks like for us, because even for 24/7 people, one 24/7 household does not look anything like the next, even when one of the people in it is the same. 24/7 with him doesn't necessarily look like it would have looked with anybody else. And so there's always a learning period and an adjustment period while you sort of figure that out together. But had he not known and been on the same page with me about the fact that this is how our relationship would look, we wouldn't have ever gotten into the relationship, because I know I know this about myself. I know this is part of who I am. I know it's not something that I can turn off or shut down or flip the switch and leave it behind, because it doesn't work that way for me. So this is largely a non-issue for people like us. But if you are in that in-between group, if you are someone for whom it's more than, oh, once in a while at a party, and less than it is an absolutely inherent characteristic that makes me who I am, you may find yourself in a relationship with Joe Vanilla and you didn't have this conversation with Joe Vanilla. And no one ever told you, perhaps, that you should have had this conversation with Joe to find out whether he was Joe Kinky or Joe Vanilla before you got into the relationship. But regardless, now you are in the relationship. And you like him. He's a good guy. You're happy overall, but you're unsatisfied because you're not getting that oh so delicious kinkiness that you are so badly craving. Now what? Well, apparently, according to social media, it is quite popular to somehow believe that it is possible and desirable and even acceptable to attempt to convert Joe. How can I convince him? How can I talk him into this? How can I get him to do this with me? I generally try to shy away from being blunt on the show because I want this to be a coffee clutch. I want this to be a coffee table discussion where we bounce ideas and we have conversations, and it's all very sort of light and fun. However, let me be very blunt at this moment. The answer to how do I convince him, how do I talk him into doing this with me is, in most cases, you don't. If you have already passed the stage of let's talk about this before we get into the relationship, which is frankly, and let me be very clear, uh, the ideal. You really ideally want to have these conversations before you ever get started in the relationship. Like, really, I cannot recommend that strongly enough. If you go on a couple of dates and you decide, okay, I think there's a shot at pursuing a relationship with this person before you get into anything serious, this is a conversation you should definitely be having. Because if you don't, it is likely to be a problem later down the road. However, if you have already passed that stage and you are no longer in the let's talk about this before we get into a relationship stage, you have exactly two possibilities when you bring this up. Well, possibly three, but initially, two possibilities. One, your partner says, I am not interested in that. I'm not doing it. It's not going to happen. Two, I'm curious, I'm interested, but I don't really know anything about it, but I'm willing to explore. These are really the two reactions that your partner could have in this scenario. If they say, hey, I'm curious, but I don't really know anything about it, then by all means pull out all your books and all your blogs and all of your links and all the things and say, okay, here's some information, so that they can then make an educated and informed decision about whether this is something that they are willing to try with you and explore with you. This is a good thing. Not quite as good as having had the conversation beforehand, but it is the best possible result in this particular set of circumstances. However, if your partner says, I am not interested, or let's take it even one step further. Let's say they don't just say, I'm not interested. They flat out tell you, I am never going to do that. I don't like that at all. It is disgusting to me, because that reaction can happen. It really, really can. And in that scenario, and that is often when we see people turning to social media and saying things like, I don't know what to do. I've been with him for, X number of, often years, X amount of time, oftentimes years. I've seen a number of cases where I've been with, him for 2 years or better, and they're just now having the conversation, which is why I reiterate that having the conversation early is definitely better. But in these situations, you've been with this guy for 2 years, you're attached, it's a good relationship, except you're not getting this, and you bring it up, and he says, no. Just straight up, no. Not willing to do that. I find it disgusting. I find it disturbing. I don't like it. I don't want it. Now what? Now you have a problem. You now have two options. Well, again, three, really. But I try to stay away from the poly discussions because that is so fraught with danger. Let me just say that poly is an option in these scenarios. However, you need to make sure that you are, in my opinion, very, very comfortable and very, very confident in your relationship before you consider opening it to others. Poly is not going to fix your problems. It may give you an outlet for certain desires that your partner can't meet for you, but the relationship needs to be very solid and very stable before that's even on the table, because otherwise it's a huge problem. And so you need to be very, very aware that that is absolutely essential, that your relationship needs to be very solid, because poly will not fix those problems. It will simply exacerbate them. So while poly is a potential third option, it is fraught with some definite concerns of its own and will be the topic of a future episode. But leaving that aside for the moment, you now have two options. One, you decide whether or not you can give up kink, because your option is you either give it up or you end the relationship. So you need to decide. And one option is to decide, am I willing to give this up? Am I willing to live without it? If the answer is yes, then there's your answer. If the answer is no, then that creates a bigger set of concerns. You have to decide whether or not this relationship is worth it to you. The other option is the unfortunate option that I see most often, which is to attempt to convince your partner who has already said they are not interested. This is where we run into problems. Consent, as we talked about before, consent is huge. Consent is massive in everything that we do. Consent matters immensely. And as we talked about in the last episode, consent on the part of your dominant matters too. So let's go back to our little example. Joe Vanilla has gotten with Katie Kinky. Katie Kinky considers herself a submissive, and Katie Kinky wants Joe to be her dom. The problem is Joe doesn't want to be a dom. He's not interested in being a dom. He doesn't like it. The whole idea just bugs him. He's not interested. If Katie Kinky then proceeds to try to turn to her Facebook groups or her Kik group or Discord server, whatever form of social media she happens to be using, and ask all her little friends, how do I talk Joe into doing this? How do I convince him? And they give her some ideas. Well, grab his hand and bring it towards your neck when you're in bed and all these sorts of things. This is not okay, in my opinion. It's really not. Joe has already told you Joe does not want to be dominant. Joe is not interested in being dominant. Joe has no desire to do this whatsoever. When you push those boundaries, you are asking him, you are violating his consent. And if you came to any of us in any form of social media and said, I told my dom I had no interest in doing X and he won't leave it alone, he keeps pushing me to do X, we would tell you that that is not acceptable behavior. Well, some of us would apparently tell you that that's a huge red flag in abuse and this, that, and the other, which is also a topic of a future episode. But universally, we would tell you that is definitely a conversation you guys need to be having, because it is not fair for your dominant to continue to try to talk you into an activity that you have told them you are not interested in. I have very few hard limits. Honestly, I really don't. I have a few, but not many. I have more soft limits, but I do have a couple of hard limits. One of my hard limits are the metal law enforcement style handcuffs. There's a whole story as to why they are a hard limit, but suffice it to say, that is a hard limit for me. I told him early on that was a hard limit for me, that was not something that I could handle playing with. It was not something I could handle doing. And he said, okay. He accepted that limit when I gave it to him. And he knew that before he put this collar around my neck. He knew that that was a hard limit for me. If he then turned around and continues to try to talk me into or convince me to do this, if I told you that I had told him something was a limit for me and he continued to try to talk me into it, you would tell me that that is not acceptable behavior. And you would be correct, because it's not. It's not fair. It is okay to periodically have a check-in. What are these things that were limits? Are they still limits? Because the limits do change. I had hard limits at the beginning of our relationship that are no longer hard limits for me. So limits do change, and it is okay to periodically say, refresh my memory, explain to me what your limits are at this moment, and things of that nature. And that is acceptable. But when someone tells you that their limits are, you cannot push them. So I fail to see why anyone would think it would be acceptable to try to push the limits of our non-kinky partner. If our non-kinky partner says, nope, not interested in that, then we need to respect that. We really, really do. And we need to maybe start thinking of it as a limit. We expect limits to be respected. That's a limit for them. They are not interested in doing that. And it is not fair to push them on that issue. This is a little bit of a shorter episode tonight, just because I can only pontificate from my soapbox for so long. But I do kind of want to sum up everything that I've talked about today, which is one, if you are a switch, that is fantastic. It is wonderful and beautiful and valid in every really way. It really, really is. But please understand that you may find yourself contacting or connected to people that are not switches. And please understand that it is also equally valid and okay for those people to say, no, no, I don't have that side of me. I really, really don't. Please also understand that this may be a sometimes thing for you. It may be something that you choose on any given day. You wake up in the morning and say, I am feeling submissive today. And that is absolutely valid if that is how it works for you. But again, I need you to please understand that it doesn't work that way for all of us. It certainly doesn't work that way for me. I don't have that in me, like, at all. I really don't. And please understand that for some of us, this is something that we do not put on and take off, that it is an absolutely immutable, set in stone characteristic within us. And finally, if you do find yourself pursuing a new relationship, please, please, please talk about your kinks and your desires in that area before you get into a serious relationship. If, however, you have already passed that point and you are now in a relationship and your partner says they are not interested in being your dom, frankly, I'll go even one step further. If your partner does not actively suggest to you, actively state to you active consent, active ongoing consent, it's not enough that they don't say this. It's not enough that they say this. If they do not actively tell you, yes, I am interested in learning more, this is something I want to explore, you need to make decisions about your continued relationship with that person. None of those decisions, in my opinion, should include trying to talk them into or convince them to engage in these kinks unless they have actively told you, I want to do this. I want to explore this. Tune in next week. We're going to hopefully be back on our normal recording schedule. And then we will actually be talking about a really interesting topic next week. We're going to talk about what is and is not abuse, or so-called red flags within the lifestyle, and the dangers of throwing those terms around quite as quickly as we often do these days. Thank you for listening. Your host, Shay, and I will see you guys next week.